The gate code had been changed. Again, I stood in the pouring rain outside the wrought iron entrance to Ravenshollow Estate, watching the red light blink mockingly on the security panel. After 18 months as head caretaker, I knew every inch of this property, every hidden pathway, every secret door in the sprawling mansion. But apparently, I no longer knew the code to enter my own workplace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My phone buzzed with a text from Vincent Blackwood himself. Security upgrade. New protocols. See Thomas in the morning for updated access. As I drove my mud-splattered truck back down the winding mountain road, leaving behind the estate I'd poured my heart into restoring, I had no idea that this was just the beginning. In 12 hours, I would discover that my entire career had been orchestrated as an elaborate deception. But in that moment, soaked to the bone and humiliated, I simply felt like a failure. What I didn't know was that by tomorrow evening, the Blackwood family would be the ones locked out of their own estate, and I would hold all the keys. My name is Claire Davidson, and until that rainy October evening, I believed I was living my dream. 18 months earlier, I had been working as a property manager for a small firm in Burlington, Vermont, handling vacation rentals and seasonal properties for wealthy out-of-state owners. It was steady work, but hardly fulfilling. I'd grown up on my grandfather's farm in rural Vermont, learning to fix everything from broken water pumps to damaged roof shingles. There was something deeply satisfying about taking care of land, about making a place beautiful and functional. When the job posting appeared for head caretaker at Ravenshollow Estate, I almost didn't apply. The salary was nearly double what I was making, and the property description read like something from a luxury magazine. A 19th-century stone mansion set on 800 acres of pristine Vermont wilderness, complete with formal gardens, a working vineyard, guest houses, and a private lake. The posting emphasized the need for someone with both technical expertise and aesthetic vision, someone who could maintain the property's historic character while modernizing its systems. I had the qualifications. Certainly, my degree in landscape architecture from the University of Vermont, combined with years of hands-on experience and my grandfather's practical wisdom, had given me a unique skill set. I could design a drainage system as easily as I could plan a perennial garden. I understood both the romance and the reality of caring for old properties. But Ravenshollow Estate represented a level of wealth and prestige that felt beyond my reach. The interview process was surprisingly intimate. Instead of meeting at some corporate office, I was invited to the estate itself on a crisp September morning, when the maple trees were just beginning to turn. Vincent Blackwood met me at the gate personally, a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair, and the kind of understated elegance that comes from generational wealth. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and well-worn hiking boots, but everything about him spoke of quiet authority. The estate took my breath away. The main house rose from a gentle hill like something from a Jane Austen novel. Its gray stone walls covered in climbing ivy that had turned brilliant crimson. The formal gardens stretched out in geometric precision, though I could see they needed attention. Beyond them, rolling meadows gave way to dense forest, and in the distance the green mountains created a backdrop of breathtaking beauty. Vincent walked me through the property himself, pointing out both its magnificence and its challenge. The heating system in the main house was original and temperamental. The vineyard, while picturesque, had been struggling with a root disease that previous caretakers hadn't known how to address. The guest cottage where the caretaker lived needed updating, though its bones were solid. Several outbuildings required significant repairs. "I'm not looking for someone to simply maintain what exists," he explained, as we stood overlooking the lake, its surface mirror smooth in the morning calm. "I want someone who can help this place reach its full potential. Someone who understands that caring for land like this is both a privilege and a responsibility." His passion seemed genuine, and I found myself opening up about my own vision for land stewardship. We discussed sustainable practices, historical preservation, and the delicate balance between progress and tradition. When he offered me the position on the spot, with a salary that would allow me to pay off my student loans and save for the future, I accepted immediately. The first few months were everything I had hoped for, and more. I threw myself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even me. I developed a comprehensive maintenance schedule, researched the history of the property, and began implementing both immediate fixes and long-term improvement. The vineyard's root disease turned out to be manageable with the right organic treatments. The heating system could be modernized without destroying its historic character. The gardens could be restored to their original glory, while incorporating sustainable practice. I lived in the guest cottage, a charming 2-bedroom stone house about a quarter-mile from the main residence. It had a working fireplace, a small but efficient kitchen, and windows that looked out over the gardens I was restoring. Every morning, I would wake up feeling grateful for the chance to spend my days caring for such a beautiful place. Vincent seemed pleased with my work. He would often stop by during his weekend visits from his primary residence in New York City, praising improvements and asking thoughtful questions about my plan. His wife Catherine was more reserved, an elegant woman in her late 50s, who seemed to view the estate as a backdrop for entertaining rather than a living ecosystem to be nurtured. Their son Harrison, fresh out of Harvard Business School, rarely visited and showed little interest in the property when he did. The first sign of trouble came during my 6th month on the job. I had submitted a detailed proposal for upgrading the property's water management system, a significant but necessary investment that would prevent flooding issues and support the expansion of the garden. The proposal included multiple bids from local contractors, a timeline for implementation, and a breakdown of long-term cost savings. I had spent weeks researching the best approaches and consulting with environmental engineers. Vincent's response was swift and dismissive. "Too expensive," he said during one of his visits, barely glancing at the carefully prepared documents. "Find a cheaper solution." I was puzzled but not discouraged. Perhaps I had been too ambitious in my initial proposal. I revised the plan, finding more economical approaches while maintaining the essential improvements. This version was also rejected, this time with a suggestion that I focus on more visible improvements that guests would appreciate. The pattern continued with other proposals. My plan to restore the historic greenhouse was deemed unnecessary. My suggestion to update the cottage's insulation was postponed indefinitely. Most frustratingly, when I presented evidence that the vineyard could be expanded and made profitable with proper investment, Vincent seemed almost annoyed by the prospect. "We're not running a commercial operation here, Claire," he said with a tone that suggested I had missed something fundamental. "This is a private retreat, not a business." I began to notice other odd dynamics. Thomas Richardson, the family lawyer, started appearing at the estate more frequently, often having long conversations with Vincent that would stop abruptly when I approached. Contractors I had worked with successfully in the past suddenly seemed reluctant to take on projects at Ravenshollow, citing vague concerns about payment terms or scheduling conflict. Grace Murphy, the housekeeper who came in twice a week to maintain the main house, began dropping hints that made me uncomfortable. "Such a shame about the last caretaker," she would say while polishing the silver in the dining room. "Natalie was so passionate about this place too, until she left so suddenly." When I asked Vincent about Natalie Hayes, his predecessor, he was vague. "Creative differences," he said with a shrug. "She had ideas that didn't align with our vision for the property." I tried to contact Natalie directly, but discovered that she had left Vermont entirely, taking a position at a botanical garden in California. The few mutual contacts I found described her departure as abrupt and mysterious. She had been well respected in the local community, known for her expertise in historic preservation and sustainable land management. Her sudden exit had surprised everyone. As winter settled over Ravenshollow, I found myself increasingly isolated. The estate's remote location, which had initially felt like a sanctuary, began to feel more like exile. Vincent's visits became less frequent, and when he did come, our interactions felt strained. Catherine barely acknowledged my presence, and Harrison seemed to view me with barely concealed hostility during his rare appearances. The work itself remained satisfying, but I was growing frustrated by the constant rejection of my improvement proposal. I had been hired to help the estate reach its potential, but every attempt to do so was met with resistance. I began to suspect that Vincent's vision for the property was fundamentally different from what he had described during our initial interview. My concerns deepened when I discovered that several of my reports and proposals had been forwarded to Thomas Richardson, without my knowledge. I only learned this when a contractor mentioned receiving questions from Mr. Blackwood's attorney about work I had recommended. When I asked Vincent about this, he brushed off my concerns. Thomas handles all our property investments, he explained. I value his input on financial matters, but something about his explanation didn't sit right with me. Why would routine maintenance decisions require legal consultation? Why hadn't Vincent mentioned this arrangement when we discussed my role and responsibilities? As spring approached, I made one more attempt to address the water management issues that I knew would become critical as the snow melted. I prepared a scaled-down proposal that addressed only the most urgent concerns, focusing on preventing damage to the main house's foundation. The cost was minimal compared to the potential damage, and I had found a local contractor willing to do the work at cost as a favor to me. Vincent's rejection was swift and final. We've decided to take a different approach to property management, he told me over the phone. Moving forward, all improvement projects will need to be approved by our board of advisors. A board of advisors. This was the first I had heard of any such entity. When I asked for details about this board and how to submit proposals to them, Vincent was evasive. Thomas will send you the information, he said, but no information ever came. It was during this period of growing confusion and frustration that Marcus Webb, the estate's groundskeeper, began to share his own concerns. Marcus had worked on the property for over a decade, long enough to see 3 different caretakers come and go. He was a man of few words, but his knowledge of the land was encyclopedic. Strange pattern, he observed one morning as we worked together to clear storm debris from the forest trails. Always the same story. New caretaker comes in, full of plans and energy, gets shot down at every turn, leaves frustrated and broke. Broke? I asked, pausing in my work. Marcus nodded grimly. Natalie spent her own money on improvements, hoping to get reimbursed later, never did. Same with the guy before her. Always some excuse about budgets or approvals. His words sent a chill through me. I had been doing exactly the same thing, using my personal credit cards to cover small expenses and emergency repairs, trusting that Vincent would reimburse me as he had promised. The amounts were starting to add up, and my requests for reimbursement were being delayed with increasing frequency. Why do they do it? I asked. Why hire people they don't intend to support? Marcus leaned on his shovel, looking out over the lake that reflected the pale spring sky. That's the question, isn't it? But I can tell you this much, they're always very careful to document every proposal you make, every expense you incur, every improvement you suggest. All gets filed away with Thomas Richardson. The implications of his words began to sink in. I thought about all the detailed reports I had submitted, the comprehensive assessments of the property's needs, the research I had conducted into sustainable improvements and historical preservation. I had essentially provided them with a complete roadmap for enhancing the estate's value, all while being prevented from implementing any of it myself. That evening, I sat in my cottage reviewing the contract I had signed 18 months earlier. Reading it with new eyes, I began to notice clauses that hadn't seemed significant at the time. The agreement included detailed intellectual property provisions, stating that any plans, designs, or improvements I developed for the estate would become the exclusive property of the Blackwood family. There were also termination clauses that seemed heavily weighted in their favor, allowing them to dismiss me with minimal notice, while requiring me to maintain confidentiality about all aspects of the property and my work there. As I studied the document, a pattern began to emerge that made my stomach turn. I wasn't just an employee, I was a consultant being paid to develop a comprehensive improvement plan for the estate, all while being systematically prevented from implementing it. The Blackwood family was essentially getting free expertise while positioning themselves to claim credit for all of my ideas. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on doing good work, on proving myself worthy of this opportunity, that I had failed to see the larger game being played. Vincent Blackwood hadn't hired me to be a caretaker in any traditional sense. He had hired me to be a resource mined for information and ideas, then discarded when I was no longer useful. The thought of Natalie Hayes and the other caretakers who had come before me filled me with a mixture of anger and determination. How many talented people had been used this way? How many careers had been damaged by this systematic exploitation? As I sat there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the beauty I had worked so hard to preserve and enhance, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't be another casualty of the Blackwood family's deception. I would find a way to turn their own game against them. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. And that meant discovering the full scope of their plan, even if it meant risking everything I had worked for. The next morning, I would begin my own investigation into the true purpose of my employment at Ravenshollow Estate. I had no idea that the truth was far worse than anything I had imagined, or that within days, I would hold the power to bring down, not just the Blackwood family's scheme, but their entire carefully constructed empire. The game was about to change, and this time, I would be the one writing the rules. The estate's library became my sanctuary, and my investigative headquarters. Every morning before dawn, I would slip into the main house using the service entrance that Marcus had shown me months earlier. The Blackwood family rarely visited during weekdays, and Grace Murphy wouldn't arrive until afternoon, giving me precious hours to explore areas of the house that had always been off-limits. The library occupied the entire east wing of the mansion's second floor, its mahogany shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. Leather-bound volumes on everything from agricultural science to art history lined the walls, but it was the modern filing cabinets hidden behind a false panel that held my attention. Marcus had mentioned seeing Thomas Richardson emerge from this room on multiple occasions, always carrying thick folders and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had accomplished something significant. The first cabinet I opened contained files on previous estate caretakers dating back 15 years. Each folder told the same disturbing story. Talented professionals hired with great fanfare, encouraged to develop comprehensive improvement plans, then systematically frustrated and eventually driven away. But it was the documentation that truly shocked. Every idea, every proposal, every innovative solution these caretakers had developed was meticulously catalogued and preserved. Natalie Hayes's file was particularly heartbreaking. Her proposals for transforming the struggling vineyard into a profitable organic operation were brilliant, complete with detailed soil analyses, marketing strategies, and financial projections. She had identified heritage grape varieties that would thrive in Vermont's climate, and developed partnerships with local restaurants and wine shops. Her plan could have generated substantial revenue while preserving the estate's historic character. Instead, her ideas had been rejected as too commercial while she was employed, but a separate folder revealed that Vincent Blackwood had implemented nearly every aspect of her plan after her departure, hiring expensive consultants who essentially rubber-stamped her work. The vineyard was now thriving, and the Blackwood family was taking full credit for its transformation. The pattern was repeated with every caretaker. James Morrison, who had worked here from 2018 to 2020, had developed a comprehensive sustainable energy plan that would have made the estate completely self-sufficient. His proposals were dismissed as too experimental, but I found evidence that the family had begun implementing his solar and geothermal recommendations the moment he left. Sarah Chen, his predecessor, had designed a wetland restoration project that would have enhanced the property's ecological value while providing natural flood control. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her work was now being touted by the Blackwoods as an example of their environmental stewardship. Each folder contained not just the caretaker's original work, but detailed analyses by various consultants who had been paid substantial fees to evaluate and refine ideas that were already complete. Thomas Richardson's law firm appeared to coordinate this process, carefully documenting the intellectual property transfers and ensuring that the original creators could never claim credit or compensation for their innovations. The financial cost of this deception was staggering. The Blackwood family had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to consultants and contractors to implement ideas that had been freely given by their own employees. But clearly the expense was worth it to maintain the fiction that these innovations originated with the family themselves. As I photographed documents with my phone, my anger grew with each revelation. These weren't just employment disputes or creative differences. This was systematic intellectual theft on a massive scale, carefully orchestrated to exploit talented individuals while enriching those who already had everything. But it was the discovery of my own file that truly took my breath away. Labeled Davidson, see Project Ravenshollow. It contained not just copies of every report and proposal I had submitted, but detailed psychological profiles prepared by a consulting firm that specialized in human resource optimization. The profiles analyzed my personality, my motivations, my financial situation, and my likely responses to various forms of pressure and manipulation. One section made my hands shake as I read it. Subject displays strong emotional attachment to land stewardship and historic preservation. Likely to invest personal resources in pursuit of project goals. Recommend initial encouragement followed by systematic rejection to maximize resource extraction before termination. They had studied me like a laboratory specimen, mapping out exactly how to exploit my passions and dedication. The consultants had even predicted that I would use my own money to fund improvements, viewing it as an acceptable loss in pursuit of what I believed was meaningful work. Another document revealed the true scope of Project Ravenshollow. The Blackwood family was preparing to sell the estate to a luxury resort developer, but they needed a comprehensive modernization plan to maximize the property's value. Rather than hiring expensive consultants up front, they had chosen to extract this expertise from a series of caretakers who would work for a fraction of the cost while providing detailed analyses of every aspect of the property. My work over the past 18 months had been particularly valuable because of my dual expertise in landscape architecture and property management. The resort developers were especially interested in my assessments of the land's recreational potential, my plans for expanding the vineyard operation, and my detailed surveys of the historic building's structural integrity. All of this information would be packaged and presented as the Blackwood family's own comprehensive development plan. The projected sale price was breathtaking: $42 million, nearly double what the property would have been worth without the improvements and planning that their caretakers had provided. The Blackwood family stood to profit enormously from work they had never paid for, while the people who had actually created value received nothing but frustration and career damage. I spent hours in that library, documenting everything I could find. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that possession of these documents wouldn't be enough. The Blackwood family had carefully structured their operations to remain technically legal, even if morally reprehensible. The intellectual property clauses in my employment contract, and those of previous caretakers, had been crafted by expensive lawyers to ensure that any legal challenge would be costly and difficult. But as I studied their methods more carefully, I began to see potential vulnerabilities in their system. The Blackwood family's confidence had made them careless in certain areas. They had documented their deception so thoroughly that their own files could be used against them if presented in the right context to the right people. More importantly, I realized that their entire scheme depended on maintaining their reputation for integrity and sophistication. Vincent Blackwood served on the boards of several prestigious conservation organizations. Catherine was deeply involved in historic preservation societies. Harrison was building a career in sustainable development consulting. Their public image as responsible stewards of Vermont's natural heritage was central to their social standing and business relationships. This reputation also underpinned their relationships with the luxury resort developers who were planning to purchase the estate. The buyers weren't just acquiring land and buildings, they were buying into the Blackwood family's carefully cultivated brand of authentic Vermont elegance and environmental responsibility. If that reputation were to be damaged by revelations of systematic exploitation and intellectual theft, the consequences would extend far beyond financial loss. The social circles that the Blackwood family moved in valued discretion and honor above almost everything else. A scandal of this nature would make them pariahs in their own community. My investigation expanded beyond the library as I began to understand the full scope of their operation. Marcus Webb proved to be an invaluable ally, his decade of experience on the property having given him insights that no single caretaker could possess. He showed me hidden storage areas where previous caretakers' personal equipment had been kept after their departures, never returned despite repeated requests. In one forgotten corner of the maintenance building, I found boxes of Natalie Hayes's research materials, including soil samples, plant specimens, and detailed notes that represented months of careful work. The casual disregard for her intellectual effort was infuriating, but the materials themselves were invaluable evidence of the scope of her contributions to the estate's transformation. Marcus also revealed that several local contractors and suppliers had grown suspicious of the Blackwood family's practices. Stories circulated in the tight-knit Vermont business community about caretakers who had been promised reimbursement for expenses that never materialized, and about innovative projects that were suddenly attributed to expensive outside consultants after the original designers had been dismissed. People talk, Marcus explained as we walked through the vineyard that Natalie had envisioned. Especially in a small community like this, the Blackwoods think their money insulates them, but folks around here have long memories. They remember who really did the work. This local knowledge became crucial as I began to piece together a broader picture of the family's operations. The intellectual theft at Ravenshollow wasn't an isolated incident. Through careful questioning and research, I discovered that Vincent Blackwood had used similar tactics at other properties he had owned over the years. A historic inn in New Hampshire, an organic farm in Massachusetts, a coastal estate in Maine, all had been improved through the systematic exploitation of talented caretakers and managers who had been hired, used, and discarded. The pattern was always the same: identify a property with unrealized potential, hire someone with the expertise to unlock that potential, extract their knowledge and ideas, then claim credit for the resulting improvements while minimizing the original creator's role. In some cases, the Blackwood family had sold these improved properties for substantial profits. In others, they had used the enhanced value to secure favorable financing for other investments. Thomas Richardson's law firm appeared to be the central coordination point for these operations, providing legal frameworks that made the intellectual theft technically permissible while ensuring that victims had little recourse. The firm specialized in agricultural and heritage property consulting, a euphemism that covered a multitude of exploitative practices. As my investigation deepened, I began to feel the weight of responsibility for all the talented individuals who had been victimized by this system. Natalie Hayes's career had been seriously damaged by her experience at Ravenshollow. Unable to provide references for her innovative work and facing financial difficulties from unreimbursed expenses, she had been forced to accept a position that didn't utilize her full capability. Other caretakers had suffered similar fates, their confidence shaken and their professional reputations tainted by their association with failed projects. But I also began to see opportunities that previous victims hadn't possessed. My background in landscape architecture had given me a thorough understanding of environmental regulations and permitting processes. I knew which agencies would be interested in evidence of fraudulent environmental stewardship claims. My business education had taught me how to trace financial flows and identify regulatory violations. Most importantly, my 18 months at Ravenshollow had given me intimate knowledge of the estate's operations and the family's method. I had access to systems and information that outsiders couldn't obtain. I was uniquely positioned to document their practices and expose the systematic nature of their exploitation. The decision to act came when I discovered the final piece of the puzzle: a detailed timeline for my own termination. Hidden in Thomas Richardson's files was a memorandum outlining the completion of the Davidson engagement. According to their schedule, I would be dismissed within the next month, just as the resort development deal entered its final stages. The memo included talking points for explaining my departure, emphasizing my inability to work within established parameters, and my unrealistic expectations regarding project approval processes. They had already prepared a narrative that would shift blame for my failures onto my own supposed shortcomings, protecting their reputation while discrediting any future complaints I might make. Reading those cold, calculated plans for my professional destruction filled me with a fury that burned through any remaining doubts about my course of action. The Blackwood family had made a fundamental miscalculation in their psychological profile of me. They had correctly identified my passion for meaningful work and my willingness to invest personal resources in pursuit of important goals, but they had failed to account for my capacity for strategic thinking and my determination to protect others from similar exploitation. They had given me access to their entire operation, trusting that my eventual termination would render any knowledge I had gained irrelevant. They had documented their crimes with meticulous care, confident that their legal protections would shield them from consequence. They had underestimated both my capabilities and my resolve. As I prepared to leave the library after another morning of investigation, I realized that the Blackwood family's own systematic approach would be the key to bringing them down. They had created detailed records of every aspect of their intellectual theft operation. They had established patterns of behavior that could be clearly demonstrated across multiple properties and victims. They had built their entire scheme on a foundation of documented evidence that could be turned against them. The challenge would be finding the right moment and the right method to deploy this evidence for maximum impact. The Blackwood family's power and connections meant that any direct confrontation would likely result in my being discredited or legally intimidated. But their dependence on reputation and their imminent business deal created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge and timing. As I walked back to my cottage through the gardens I had restored, I began to formulate a plan that would not only expose the Blackwood family's crimes, but also provide justice for all the talented individuals they had victimized. The estate that had been intended as the scene of my professional destruction would instead become the stage for their downfall. The irony wasn't lost on me that they had spent months documenting my capabilities and psychology, never realizing that I was also learning about theirs. Their files contained detailed information about their methods, their contacts, their business relationships, and their vulnerabilities. In their arrogance, they had provided me with everything I needed to destroy them. The game was about to change, and this time I would be playing by my own rules. The discovery of my termination timeline accelerated everything. Knowing I had less than a month before they disposed of me meant I had to move quickly, but it also gave me a crucial advantage. I could plan my response while they believed I remained ignorant of their intention. Their confidence in their own superiority had blinded them to the possibility that their carefully chosen victim might fight back. My mornings in the library became more focused and systematic. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was building a comprehensive case that would expose the full scope of their operation. Using my phone, I photographed hundreds of documents, creating a digital archive that captured not just individual instances of intellectual theft, but the methodical nature of their entire enterprise. The psychological profiles proved particularly damaging. The consulting firm that had analyzed previous caretakers had documented their strategies for emotional manipulation with clinical precision. They had identified each victim's professional vulnerabilities and personal motivations, then developed specific tactics for exploiting those weaknesses. The cold, calculated nature of this psychological warfare would shock anyone who saw it. But I needed more than documentation. I needed allies who could help me present this evidence in a way that would have maximum impact. My first call was to Diana Foster, the local real estate agent who had been peripherally involved in several of the Blackwood family's property transactions over the years. Diana had built her career on integrity and community connections, values that put her at odds with the exploitative practices I had uncovered. I approached Diana carefully, initially framing my concerns as questions about standard practices in estate management. Her responses confirmed what I had suspected. The Blackwood family's methods were highly unusual and ethically questionable, even if they remained technically legal. Most property owners who hire caretakers want to see their ideas implemented, Diana explained as we sat in her office, overlooking Millbrook's Main Street. The whole point is to improve the property's value and functionality. When someone consistently rejects good proposals, it usually means they're either financially constrained or they have other plans for the property. When I shared some of the less sensitive documents I had discovered, Diana's expression grew increasingly troubled. As someone who had worked in Vermont real estate for over 20 years, she immediately understood the implications of what I was showing her. "This isn't just unethical," she said, studying the timeline of Natalie Hayes's vineyard proposal and its subsequent implementation. "This could constitute fraud, depending on how they've represented the property's improvements to potential buyers or investors." Diana's perspective helped me understand another crucial aspect of the Blackwood family's operation. Their systematic intellectual theft wasn't just about avoiding consulting fees. It was about creating a false narrative of their own expertise and innovation. This fabricated reputation enhanced their credibility in business deals and social circles, providing ongoing value far beyond the immediate savings from exploiting their caretakers. She also provided insights into the luxury resort development deal that was driving their current timeline. The developers, Cascade Hospitality Group, were known for their meticulous due diligence and their emphasis on authentic, sustainable luxury experiences. They would be extremely sensitive to any suggestions that their Vermont property had been developed through exploitative practice. Cascade's entire brand is built on responsible development and authentic partnerships with local communities, Diana explained. If they discovered that the Blackwood family had systematically exploited local talent to create the very improvements that make the property attractive, it would be a public relations nightmare. They'd walk away from the deal immediately. This insight crystallized my strategy. Rather than pursuing legal action that would be expensive and uncertain, I would focus on exposing the Blackwood family's practices to the people and organizations that mattered most to them. Their business partners, their social peers, and the professional communities they sought to impress would be far more effective judges than any court. My next ally was Robert Chen, the financial advisor who had been peripherally involved in some of the Blackwood family's property transactions. Robert had built his practice on serving Vermont's land-rich but cash-poor families, helping them navigate the complex financial challenges of maintaining historic properties in a modern economy. His expertise in agricultural and conservation finance made him uniquely qualified to understand the true value of the work that had been stolen from the estate's caretaker. I approached Robert through a mutual contact, initially seeking advice about irregularities I had noticed in property management practices. His immediate concern and willingness to help convinced me that he could be trusted with more sensitive information. Robert's analysis of the financial documents I had discovered was devastating. He calculated that the Blackwood family had extracted over $2 million worth of professional expertise from their caretakers over the past decade, while paying them perhaps 10% of what equivalent consulting services would have cost. This goes beyond simple exploitation, he concluded after reviewing the evidence. They've created a systematic mechanism for converting other people's intellectual labor into their own wealth. The tax implications alone could be significant, especially if they've been claiming credits for environmental improvements that were actually designed and implemented by their employees. Robert also helped me understand the broader context of Vermont's conservation and development community. The state's small size and tight-knit professional networks meant that news of the Blackwood family's practices would spread quickly once it became public. Many of the people they had exploited were well known and respected in these circles, and their mistreatment would generate both sympathy and outrage. Armed with this growing understanding of my adversary's vulnerabilities, I began reaching out to previous victims of their system. Natalie Hayes was surprisingly easy to locate in California, and her response to my carefully worded email was immediate and enthusiastic. She had suspected that her ideas were being used after her departure, but had lacked the resources to investigate or challenge the Blackwood family's claim. "I've been watching their vineyard operation from afar," she wrote. "Everything they're doing is straight from my proposals, down to the specific grape varieties and organic certification process. But when I tried to include that work in my portfolio for other positions, they claimed it was all preliminary research that was never implemented." Natalie's willingness to collaborate gave me access to her original research materials and documentation of her communications with the Blackwood family. Her records provided crucial evidence of how innovative ideas were systematically appropriated and rebranded. Other former caretakers were similarly eager to cooperate once they understood that someone was finally taking action. James Morrison had kept copies of all his sustainable energy proposals, along with detailed records of the expenses he had incurred while developing those plans. Sarah Chen had documentation of her wetland restoration work, including before and after photographs that clearly showed the implementation of her designs. As I built this coalition of former employees, a broader picture emerged of the Blackwood family's method. Each caretaker had been isolated and made to feel that their struggles were personal failures rather than part of a systematic pattern. They had been psychologically manipulated into doubting their own competence and professionalism, making them less likely to challenge their treatment or seek support from colleagues. The reunion of these talented individuals, brought together by their shared victimization, created a powerful sense of solidarity and purpose. They weren't just seeking personal vindication, they were determined to prevent other dedicated professionals from suffering similar exploitation. Marcus Webb's role became increasingly important as my investigation deepened. His long tenure at the estate had given him access to information that no individual caretaker could possess. He had witnessed the entire cycle of exploitation multiple times, and his practical knowledge of the property's operations provided crucial context for understanding how stolen ideas had been implemented. "Every improvement you see here came from one of the caretakers," he told me as we walked through the restored gardens. "That water feature there, that was James Morrison's design. The native plant restoration along the lake shore, that was Sarah Chen's work. Even the maintenance building renovations came from ideas that David Torres developed before you came along." Marcus also revealed that several local contractors and suppliers had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the Blackwood family's practice. They had been asked to bid on projects using caretakers' detailed specifications, only to have those same caretakers dismissed before the work could begin. The contractors had completed the projects using the fired employees' plans, but many had refused to work with the Blackwood family again. This network of local businesses that had been made unwilling participants in the exploitation provided another avenue for exposing the family's practice. Many of these contractors were well-established members of the Vermont business community, and their testimony about the systematic nature of the intellectual theft would carry significant weight. The evidence I was gathering painted a picture of an operation that was far more extensive and sophisticated than I had initially realized. The Blackwood family hadn't simply stumbled into a pattern of exploiting their employees. They had deliberately designed a system for extracting maximum value from talented individuals, while minimizing their own costs and legal exposure. Thomas Richardson's law firm had clearly played a central role in developing this system. Their intellectual property clauses were carefully crafted to be just vague enough to provide legal cover while ensuring that caretakers had no meaningful recourse. The psychological profiling they had commissioned showed a level of premeditation that transformed individual instances of exploitation into evidence of a criminal enterprise. But as damaging as this evidence was, I knew that simply possessing it wouldn't be enough to bring down the Blackwood family. They had money, connections, and legal resources that could overwhelm any conventional challenge. They had survived previous complaints and concerns by isolating their critics and discrediting their claims. The key to defeating them lay in understanding that their entire operation depended on maintaining carefully constructed facades. Vincent Blackwood's reputation as a conservation-minded steward of Vermont's natural heritage was central to his business relationships and social standing. Catherine's role in historic preservation organizations provided her with credibility and influence. Harrison's career in sustainable development consulting required maintaining an image of ethical leadership and environmental responsibility. These public personas weren't just vanity projects, they were essential components of the family's financial success. The luxury resort developers who were planning to purchase Ravenshollow weren't just buying real estate. They were investing in the Blackwood family's carefully cultivated brand of authentic Vermont sophistication and environmental responsibility. If that brand were to be destroyed by revelations of systematic exploitation and intellectual theft, the consequences would cascade through every aspect of their lives. Business partnerships would dissolve, social connections would be severed, and future opportunities would disappear. The challenge was finding the right moment and method to deploy the evidence I had gathered for maximum impact. The Blackwood family's power and connections meant that any premature revelation would likely result in my being discredited or legally intimidated. But their dependence on reputation and their imminent business deal created a window of vulnerability that could be exploited with the right timing and strategy. As I prepared for the final phase of my investigation, I realized that the Blackwood family's own systematic approach would provide the template for their destruction. They had documented their crimes with meticulous care, confident that their legal protections would shield them from consequences. They had created patterns of behavior that could be clearly demonstrated across multiple properties and victims. Most importantly, they had underestimated the very people they had victimized. The talented caretakers they had exploited, possessed not just technical expertise, but also the intelligence and determination to fight back when given the opportunity. Their mistake was assuming that emotional manipulation and legal intimidation would be enough to keep their victims silent and isolated. The estate they had used as a laboratory for perfecting their exploitation techniques would soon become the stage for their downfall. The irony was perfect. Their own carefully documented methods would provide the evidence needed to destroy them, delivered by the very person they had trained to be their next victim. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early November, exactly 23 days before my scheduled termination, according to Thomas Richardson's internal memorandum. Vincent Blackwood's voice carried an unusual urgency as he requested an emergency meeting at the estate that afternoon. Something in his tone told me that the carefully orchestrated timeline was accelerating. I arrived at the main house to find not just Vincent, but Catherine Harrison and Thomas Richardson gathered in the formal living room. The atmosphere was tense, and their expressions ranged from worried to openly hostile. Harrison, in particular, seemed barely able to contain his anger as I entered the room. "Claire," Vincent began with forced casualness, "we've been reviewing the estate's operational efficiency, and we've decided to implement some immediate changes." The script was as predictable as it was insulting. They were moving up my termination, probably because something had spooked them. I maintained my composure, playing the role of the dedicated but confused employee, while studying their faces for clues about what had triggered this emergency meeting. Thomas Richardson cleared his throat and opened a leather portfolio. "We've received some concerning reports about unauthorized access to certain areas of the property," he said, his lawyer's instincts making him choose his words carefully. "There have also been questions raised about the propriety of some recent communications with former employees, so they knew about my investigation." The question was how much they knew and what had alerted them. I kept my expression neutral while my mind raced through the possibilities. Had someone seen me in the library? Had one of the former caretakers inadvertently revealed our communication? Or had their own paranoia finally caught up with their guilt? "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I replied calmly. "I've been focused on preparing the property for winter and addressing the maintenance issues you've asked me to prioritize." Harrison leaned forward aggressively. "Cut the act," he snapped. "We know you've been snooping around where you don't belong and stirring up trouble with people who should stay in the past." Catherine placed a restraining hand on her son's arm, but her own expression was cold and calculating. "What Harrison means," she said smoothly, "is that we're concerned about your recent behavior and its potential impact on the estate's reputation and operations." Vincent resumed control of the conversation with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to difficult negotiation. "The bottom line is that your employment here is no longer working out. We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package in exchange for a smooth transition and your commitment to maintaining confidentiality about all aspects of your work here." The offer they presented was simultaneously insulting and revealing: a modest cash payment, immediate termination of my cottage lease, and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing my experiences at Ravenshollow with anyone. The legal language was dense and intimidating, clearly designed to discourage careful analysis, but buried within the technical jargon were clauses that confirmed my worst suspicions about their intention. I would be required to surrender all materials related to my work at the estate, including research, photographs, and correspondence. I would be prohibited from claiming credit for any improvements or innovations I had developed during my employment. Most tellingly, I would be barred from communicating with any former employees of the Blackwood family or their business partners. "This seems quite comprehensive," I said, flipping through the pages while carefully controlling my expression. "I'll need some time to review it thoroughly." "Actually," Thomas Richardson interjected, "we need your decision today. The situation has become time-sensitive, and we can't afford delays." The pressure tactics were as transparent as they were desperate. Something had definitely spooked them, and they were rushing to contain what they perceived as a threat. Their urgency was actually an advantage, because it meant they were acting reactively rather than strategically. "I understand your concerns," I said, setting down the document. "But this is a significant decision that will affect my career and my future. I'm sure you can appreciate that I need at least 48 hours to consider it properly." The room fell silent, as the family exchanged glances. Harrison looked ready to explode, while Catherine's fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of her chair. Vincent's facade of reasonableness was beginning to crack, revealing the calculating businessman beneath. "Very well," he said finally. 48 hours. "But during that time, your access to the estate will be limited to your cottage and the immediate grounds. You're not to enter the main house or any of the outbuildings without explicit permission." The restrictions confirmed that they knew about my investigation and were trying to prevent me from gathering additional evidence, but they were too late. I already had everything I needed, carefully documented and safely stored in multiple locations. Their attempts to limit my access were merely symbolic gestures that revealed their own anxiety. As I prepared to leave, Catherine made one final attempt at intimidation. "I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation, Claire," she said with icy precision. "The Blackwood family has extensive resources and connections throughout Vermont and beyond. We protect our interests very aggressively, when necessary." The threat was unmistakable, but it also demonstrated how thoroughly they had misunderstood both my capabilities and my intention. They were still thinking in terms of silencing a disgruntled employee, not recognizing that they were facing someone who had systematically documented their crimes and built a coalition of allies, ready to support the truth. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with my growing network of former caretakers and local allies. Diana Foster offered her real estate office as a secure location, and by 8 o'clock we had assembled a war council that would have impressed any military strategist. Natalie Hayes had flown in from California at her own expense, bringing copies of all her original research and proposals. James Morrison had driven up from Massachusetts with detailed financial records showing exactly how much of his own money he had invested in projects that were later credited to the Blackwood family. Sarah Chen participated via video call from her current position in Oregon, providing crucial testimony about the systematic nature of the exploitation. Robert Chen had spent the day analyzing the financial implications of what we had discovered, and his conclusions were devastating. The tax fraud alone could result in millions of dollars in penalties and interest, he explained. If they've been claiming environmental tax credits for improvements that were actually designed and funded by their employees, the IRS will be very interested in pursuing this. Diana Foster had reached out to her contacts in the Vermont business community, and the response had been immediate and supportive. Contractors, suppliers, and other professionals, who had been made unwilling participants in the Blackwood family's schemes, were eager to provide testimony about what they had witnessed. But the most significant development came from Marcus Webb, who had spent the day documenting the estate's current condition with photographs and detailed notes. His decades of experience on the property gave him unique credibility, and his willingness to testify about what he had observed would be devastating to any claims the Blackwood family might make about their own contributions to the estate's improvement. "Every major improvement on this property came from one of the caretakers," Marcus stated flatly. "The family contributed nothing but money to implement other people's ideas, and half the time, they didn't even pay for the implementation properly." As we planned our strategy, the scope of our evidence became clear. We had documented proof of intellectual theft spanning over a decade. We had financial records showing systematic exploitation of talented professionals. We had testimony from multiple witnesses about the family's methods and practices. Most importantly, we had the Blackwood family's own internal documents, including the psychological profiles that revealed the premeditated nature of their exploitation. The question was how to deploy this evidence for maximum impact. Simply releasing everything at once might allow the family to contain the damage through their lawyers and public relations experts, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that revealed their crimes to the specific audiences that mattered most to them could be devastating. Diana Foster suggested starting with the luxury resort developers who were planning to purchase the estate. Cascade Hospitality Group built their entire brand on ethical partnerships and authentic experiences, she explained. If they discover that the property they're buying was developed through systematic exploitation, they'll not only cancel the deal but probably issue a public statement, distancing themselves from the Blackwood family. Robert Chen recommended simultaneously contacting the tax authorities and environmental agencies that had approved various credits and certifications based on fraudulent claims about the family's environmental stewardship. Once government agencies start investigating, the pressure will be enormous, he noted, and the publicity will make it impossible for them to quietly resolve the situation. Natalie Hayes had the most personal stake in seeing justice done, and her suggestion was perhaps the most elegant. The Vermont Association of Landscape Architects is holding their annual conference next week, she said. Vincent Blackwood is scheduled to give the keynote address about sustainable estate management and environmental stewardship. What if he had to give that speech while facing questions about his systematic exploitation of the very professionals he's supposed to be addressing? The plan that emerged from our discussion was comprehensive and devastating. We would simultaneously contact the resort developers, government agencies, professional organizations, and local media outlets. The evidence would be presented in carefully prepared packages that highlighted the specific aspects most relevant to each audience. The timing would be crucial. We would coordinate our revelations to occur just as the Blackwood family's 48-hour deadline expired, maximizing their shock and minimizing their ability to respond effectively. By the time they realized what was happening, the damage would already be done. As our meeting concluded, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction and justice. The Blackwood family had spent months studying my psychology and planning my destruction, never realizing that they were providing me with all the tools I needed to bring them down. Their own arrogance and systematic approach would be turned against them with devastating effect. The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparation. I used my remaining access to the estate to document any last details that might be useful, while maintaining the appearance of someone struggling with a difficult decision about the severance offer. The Blackwood family's obvious anxiety and increasingly frequent phone calls to Thomas Richardson suggested that they were growing more nervous as the deadline approached. On Thursday evening, exactly 48 hours after their ultimatum, I called Vincent Blackwood to request a final meeting. The family assembled in the same formal living room, where they had attempted to intimidate me 2 days earlier, but the dynamics had already shifted dramatically. "I've made my decision about your offer," I announced as I took my seat across from them. "I'm declining your severance packet." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Harrison started to speak, but I continued before he could interrupt. "However, I do have a counter-proposal that I think you'll find interesting." Vincent's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation in his eye. "What kind of counter-proposal?" I smiled calmly and pulled out my phone, the kind that comes with a complete understanding of your operations over the past decade. With deliberate precision, I began showing them photographs of their own internal documents, the psychological profile, the financial analyses, the detailed plans for intellectual theft, the correspondence about my own scheduled termination. Their faces went progressively paler as they realized the scope of what I had discovered. "Where did you get those?" Thomas Richardson's demanded, his lawyer's instincts finally overcoming his shock. "From your own files," I replied pleasantly. "You really should be more careful about security in that library, although I suppose you never expected one of your victims to fight back." Catherine's composure cracked completely. "You had no right to access those materials," she snapped. "This is theft, pure and simple." Catherine's accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The irony of being accused of theft by people who had built their entire operation on stealing others' intellectual property was so profound that I almost laughed. Instead, I maintained my calm demeanor and continued with my presentation. "Theft is an interesting word choice, Catherine," I said, swiping to the next photograph on my phone. "Perhaps we should discuss what actual theft looks like." The image showed Natalie Hayes's original vineyard proposal alongside a recent article in Vermont Life magazine that credited Vincent Blackwood as the visionary behind the estate's award-winning organic wine operation. The side-by-side comparison was devastating, showing identical soil analyses, grape variety selections, and even matching architectural drawings for the tasting room that had never been built during Natalie's tenure. Harrison leaned forward to examine the screen, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "That's completely different," he protested. "Those were just preliminary ideas that we developed further." I swiped again, revealing a timestamp on Natalie's original files that predated her departure by 6 months, alongside internal emails showing the Blackwood family implementing her exact specifications 3 weeks after her termination. The chronology was undeniable and damning. Thomas Richardson attempted to regain control of the situation with legal posturing. Even if these allegations had merit, which they don't, any work performed by employees during their tenure becomes the intellectual property of their employer. That's clearly stated in all our employment contracts. You're absolutely right about the contracts, I agreed, pulling up another document on my phone. But there's an interesting legal principle about intellectual property obtained through fraudulent inducement. When you hire someone under false pretenses, systematically sabotage their ability to implement their ideas, then claim credit for those ideas after terminating them, the legal protections become significantly more complicated. I showed them a legal analysis that Robert Chen had commissioned from a specialist in intellectual property law. The attorney's conclusions were clear. The Blackwood family's systematic pattern of deception and exploitation could potentially void the intellectual property clauses in their employment contracts, especially if criminal fraud could be demonstrated. Vincent finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled but betraying underlying tension. What exactly do you want, Claire? The question revealed that he understood the precarious position they were in. They could no longer intimidate or dismiss me as a disgruntled employee. The evidence I possessed transformed our dynamic completely, putting them on the defensive for the first time in their carefully orchestrated scheme. I want justice, I replied simply. For Natalie, for James, for Sarah, for David Torres, and for every other talented professional you've exploited over the years. I began outlining what justice looked like in practical terms. Full public acknowledgement of each caretaker's contributions to the estate's improvement. Financial compensation, reflecting the true value of their stolen intellectual property. Written apologies that could be used to restore their professional reputations. And most importantly, a complete cessation of their exploitative practices. Catherine's reaction was immediate and predictable. Absolutely not, she declared. We will not be extorted by a disgruntled employee with delusions of grandeur. Her choice of words revealed how completely they misunderstood the situation they faced. This wasn't extortion, it was accountability. And I wasn't a lone disgruntled employee. I was the spokesperson for a coalition of victims who had finally found their voice. Extortion implies that I'm making unreasonable demands for personal gain, I replied calmly. But since you've rejected my reasonable proposal, let me show you what unreasonable actually looks like. I pulled out a tablet and began displaying a series of prepared presentations. The first was addressed to Cascade Hospitality Group, the luxury resort developers planning to purchase Ravenshollow Estate. It included detailed documentation of how the property's acclaimed improvements had been systematically stolen from exploited employees, along with analysis of the legal and public relations risks associated with completing the transaction. The second presentation was designed for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, documenting how the Blackwood family had claimed tax credits and environmental certifications based on fraudulent representations about their own contributions to the estate's ecological improvements. The third was prepared for the Internal Revenue Service, outlining potential tax fraud related to claiming business deductions for consulting fees that had actually been extracted from unpaid employee labor. The fourth presentation targeted the Vermont Association of Landscape Architects, providing detailed evidence of intellectual property theft for the organization's upcoming conference, where Vincent was scheduled to speak about ethical land stewardship. As I scrolled through slide after slide of documented evidence, organized for maximum impact on each specific audience, the blood drained from the faces around me. They were finally beginning to understand the scope of what they faced. Thomas Richardson made one last attempt at legal intimidation. Any release of privileged information would constitute a serious breach of your employment contract and could result in significant financial penalties. I smiled and pulled up one final document on my tablet. That's true, assuming the employment contract itself isn't fraudulent. But when an employer uses systematic deception to extract intellectual property under false pretenses, the contract becomes legally questionable. The document was an opinion letter from a prominent Vermont employment attorney who had reviewed my situation and concluded that the Blackwood family's practices likely constituted criminal fraud under state law. The attorney had also noted that employment contracts obtained through fraudulent inducement were typically unenforceable, meaning their non-disclosure and intellectual property clauses would provide no protection. The room fell into stunned silence as the implications sank in. They had built their entire operation on the assumption that legal technicalities would protect them from consequences. The discovery that their own fraudulent behavior had undermined those protections was clearly devastating. Vincent made one final attempt to regain control. Even if some of your allegations had merit, the damage to everyone involved would be enormous. Think about your own career prospects if you become known as someone who wages warfare against former employers. It was a desperate gambit, appealing to my self-interest while ignoring the moral dimension of their systematic exploitation. But it also revealed that he still didn't understand who he was dealing with or what motivated my actions. My career prospects are actually quite good, I replied. Diana Foster has already offered me a partnership in her real estate firm, specializing in ethical property management. Robert Chen wants me to consult on sustainable development projects, and several of Vermont's leading conservation organizations have expressed interest in my expertise. I paused to let that information sink in before continuing. But more importantly, I've discovered that building a career on integrity and authentic relationships is far more satisfying than climbing a ladder built on other people's suffering. Harrison made one last desperate play. You're destroying a family business that's been built over generations. The audacity of his statement was breathtaking. Actually, I corrected, I'm exposing the fact that your family business has been built on systematically stealing other people's work. The destruction was your own choice, not mine. I stood up and began packing away my devices. You have until tomorrow morning to consider my original proposal, full acknowledgement and compensation for your victims, public apologies, and cessation of your exploitative practices. If I don't hear from you by 9 a.m., the presentations I've shown you will be delivered to their intended recipients. As I moved toward the door, Vincent called out desperately, "Wait. Perhaps we can find some middle ground here." I turned back to face him, noting the fear that was now openly visible in his expression. There is no middle ground between exploitation and justice, Vincent. You built your reputation and your wealth by systematically victimizing talented people who trusted you. The only question now is whether you'll take responsibility for that voluntarily or have it imposed on you by others. The drive back to my cottage was surreal. After months of feeling powerless and manipulated, I had finally confronted my tormentors with the truth about their crime. The looks of shock and fear on their faces, as they realized the scope of evidence against them, had been deeply satisfying, but I also felt a profound sadness for all the talented individuals who had suffered under their system before I had been able to expose it. Natalie Hayes's career had been set back by years. James Morrison had been forced to abandon innovative projects that could have transformed sustainable energy practices. Sarah Chen's groundbreaking ecological work had been credited to others while she struggled to rebuild her professional reputation. The phone calls began within an hour of my return to the cottage. Thomas Richardson tried a combination of legal threats and financial inducement. Catherine attempted emotional manipulation, suggesting that I was destroying innocent family members who had played no role in the estate's management. Harrison oscillated between rage and desperation, making increasingly wild claims about the consequences I would face. I didn't answer any of their calls. The time for negotiation had passed, and their desperate attempts to find leverage only confirmed that my strategy was working. They were finally experiencing the powerlessness and fear that they had systematically inflicted on their victims. Instead, I spent the evening making final preparations for the next day's revelations. Each presentation was carefully crafted to resonate with its specific audience, highlighting the aspects of the Blackwood family's crimes that would be most shocking and relevant to each group. The presentation for Cascade Hospitality Group emphasized the public relations nightmare they would face if they completed the purchase of a property developed through systematic exploitation. Their entire brand was built on authentic luxury experiences and ethical partnerships with local communities. Association with the Blackwood family's practices would be devastating to their carefully cultivated image. The materials for government agencies focused on the financial fraud and regulatory violations that had enabled the family's theft of tax credits and environmental certification. The documentation was comprehensive enough to trigger serious investigations that would consume enormous resources and generate ongoing negative publicity. The presentation for professional organizations highlighted the personal stories of individual victims, putting human faces on the systematic exploitation. The Vermont Association of Landscape Architects would be particularly outraged to learn that one of their featured speakers had built his reputation by stealing the work of their own members. As I reviewed the final preparations, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction at the elegance of the solution I had developed. The Blackwood family had used their victims' own expertise against them, claiming credit for innovations, while systematically preventing their implementation. Now their own systematic documentation would be used against them, providing the evidence needed to destroy the reputation and relationships they had built on stolen foundations. The irony was perfect. Their confidence in their legal protections had led them to document their crimes with meticulous care. Their psychological profiling of victims had revealed the premeditated nature of their exploitation. Their systematic approach to intellectual theft had created patterns that could be clearly demonstrated across multiple properties and victims. Most importantly, their arrogance had blinded them to the possibility that their carefully chosen victims might possess the intelligence and determination to fight back effectively. They had selected talented professionals for exploitation, never considering that those same talents could be turned against them when properly motivated and organized. The night passed slowly as I waited for 9 a.m., the deadline I had set for their response. I knew they were frantically consulting with lawyers, public relations experts, and crisis management specialists, but the evidence against them was so comprehensive and damaging that no amount of expensive advice could change their fundamental predicament. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone rang. Vincent Blackwood's voice was barely recognizable, stripped of its usual confidence and authority. "Claire, we need to talk." "I'm listening," I replied calmly. "We're prepared to discuss your proposals in good faith. Perhaps we can find a solution that addresses everyone's concerns without unnecessary damage to any party." The language was classic crisis management speak, designed to minimize admissions while opening negotiations. But the fear in his voice told me everything I needed to know about their position. "Vincent," I said firmly, "there's only one solution that addresses everyone's concerns: full acknowledgement of what you've done, proper compensation for your victims, and an end to your exploitative practices. Anything less isn't a solution. It's just another attempt at manipulation." The long pause that followed told me he was consulting with others, probably Thomas Richardson and the crisis management team they had inevitably assembled overnight. "We might be able to consider some form of acknowledgement," he said finally, "but the financial demands are unrealistic, and we can't accept responsibility for alleged practices that were standard business operation." His response confirmed that they still didn't understand the gravity of their situation. They were trying to negotiate as if they held some form of leverage, when in fact they were completely exposed and vulnerable. "Vincent," I said with finality, "you've had 12 hours to consider my proposal, and your response shows that you're still not taking this seriously. The presentations are being delivered now." I ended the call and began executing the plan that my coalition had spent days perfecting. The first email went to Cascade Hospitality Group's board of directors, marked urgent and confidential. The comprehensive presentation detailed every aspect of the Blackwood family's intellectual theft operation, with particular emphasis on how the estate's acclaimed improvements had been systematically stolen from exploited employees. The second email targeted the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, documenting the fraudulent basis for the estate's environmental certifications and tax credits. The evidence was so clear and comprehensive that an investigation would be inevitable. The third presentation went to the Internal Revenue Service, outlining potential tax fraud related to the family's claims of business expenses and environmental improvements that had actually been developed and funded by unpaid employee labor. Additional materials were sent to the Vermont Association of Landscape Architects, the Vermont Business Ethics Council, and 3 different media outlets, known for their investigative reporting on corporate misconduct. Each presentation was carefully crafted to trigger immediate action from its recipients. The evidence was so overwhelming and the documentation so thorough that the organizations receiving it would have no choice but to respond quickly and decisively. As I finished sending the final email, my phone began ringing immediately. Vincent Blackwood was calling back, probably having realized what was happening from his monitoring of the family's email accounts and business communications. This time, I didn't answer. The time for conversation had passed. The Blackwood family had spent months planning my professional destruction, documenting their crimes with arrogant confidence in their own immunity. Now those same documents would be used to bring them down, delivered by the very person they had trained to be their next victim. The estate that had been intended as the scene of my humiliation would instead become the stage for their downfall. The irony was perfect, and the justice was long overdue. Within 3 hours the responses began arriving. Cascade Hospitality Group's legal team sent an immediate notice suspending all negotiations, pending investigation of the allegation. The Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation opened a formal inquiry into the estate's certifications. The IRS acknowledged receipt of the materials and indicated that they would be reviewed by their fraud investigation unit. The Vermont Association of Landscape Architects sent an emergency notice to Vincent Blackwood, informing him that his keynote address had been canceled pending review of serious allegations about his professional conduct. Most satisfying of all was the call from Diana Foster, who had been monitoring local news outlets for coverage of the story. "Claire," she said with barely contained excitement, "Channel 3 is leading their noon broadcast with breaking news about a major fraud investigation involving a prominent Vermont family. They're not naming names yet, but they're promising extensive coverage throughout the day." The carefully constructed facade that had protected the Blackwood family for decades was finally crumbling. Their reputation for integrity and environmental stewardship was being exposed as an elaborate fiction built on the systematic exploitation of talented professionals. But more importantly, the talented individuals they had victimized were finally getting the acknowledgement and justice they deserved. Natalie Hayes would be able to reclaim credit for her innovative vineyard development. James Morrison's sustainable energy innovations would be properly attributed. Sarah Chen's ecological restoration work would be recognized for its true value. The Blackwood family had made a fundamental miscalculation in their psychological assessment of me. They had correctly identified my passion for meaningful work and my willingness to invest personal resources in pursuit of important goals, but they had failed to account for my capacity for strategic thinking and my determination to protect others from similar exploitation. They had given me access to their entire operation, trusting that my eventual termination would render any knowledge I had gained irrelevant. They had documented their crimes with meticulous care, confident that their legal protections would shield them from consequence. They had underestimated both my capabilities and my resolve. The game had changed completely, and this time justice would prevail. The first news van arrived at Ravenshollow's gates at 2:30 in the afternoon. By evening, the narrow mountain road leading to the estate resembled a media encampment, with satellite trucks from regional television stations, creating an impromptu village of journalists and camera crew. The story had exploded beyond Vermont's borders, picked up by national outlets fascinated by the combination of old money scandal and systematic exploitation of working professionals. I watched the circus unfold from my cottage window, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and surreal disbelief. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had been facing termination and legal intimidation from people who seemed untouchable. Now those same people were trapped inside their mansion, refusing to answer calls from reporters while their carefully constructed world collapsed around them. The media coverage was more comprehensive and damaging than I had dared to hope. Channel 3's investigative team had spent the afternoon interviewing former caretakers, local contractors, and business associates who had witnessed the Blackwood family's practices firsthand. The personal stories emerging from these interviews painted a devastating picture of systematic exploitation, disguised as legitimate business operation. Natalie Hayes had driven back from the airport to participate in a live television interview, her dignity and professionalism providing a stark contrast to the family's refusal to comment. Standing in front of the vineyard she had envisioned and designed, she calmly explained how her innovative organic farming proposals had been rejected as too commercial during her employment, only to be implemented word for word after her dismissal. The most painful part wasn't the loss of credit, she told the interviewer, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion underlying her words. It was watching something I had poured my heart into being presented as someone else's vision while I struggled to find work because I couldn't provide references for my most significant accomplishment. James Morrison's interview was equally powerful, particularly when he demonstrated the sustainable energy systems that had been installed throughout the estate using his exact specifications and technical drawing. His documentation was so thorough that the television crew was able to overlay his original proposals with current photographs, showing precise matches down to specific equipment models and installation detail. I spent 8 months developing these systems, he explained, pointing to the solar array that now powered the main house. I researched every component, designed the integration with the historic building, and even negotiated preliminary pricing with suppliers. When they rejected the proposal as too experimental, I assumed they weren't ready for innovation. I never imagined they were waiting for me to leave so they could claim the work as their own. The interviews with local contractors were perhaps most damaging to the Blackwood family's remaining credibility. These were established Vermont business people with decades of experience and sterling reputation. Their reluctant but honest testimonies about being asked to bid on projects using fired employees' detailed specifications created an undeniable pattern of exploitation. Tom Sullivan, who had installed the estate's water management system, spoke with obvious discomfort about his involvement in the scheme. They gave me complete engineering drawings, material specifications, even suggested contractors for specialized work, he explained. When I asked about the original designer to clarify some technical questions, they told me it was proprietary work done by their consultants. It wasn't until later that I learned the woman who designed it had been fired 3 weeks before I got the contract. The business community's response was swift and decisive. By late afternoon, 3 different contractors had publicly announced they would no longer work with the Blackwood family. 2 suppliers had suspended credit arrangements pending resolution of the allegation. Most significantly, the Vermont Sustainable Business Council had issued a statement calling for a thorough investigation of practices that violated the organization's core ethical principles. The impact on Vincent Blackwood's professional reputation was immediate and devastating. His memberships on conservation organization boards were quietly suspended, pending investigation. Speaking engagements were canceled. Business partnerships that had taken years to develop were dissolved with terse statements about incompatible value. Catherine's involvement in historic preservation organizations faced similar scrutiny. The Vermont Preservation Trust, where she had served as a board member for over a decade, announced that she had stepped aside from her leadership role, while the organization reviewed recent project approvals that might have been influenced by fraudulent expertise claims. Harrison's career in sustainable development consulting was effectively ended before it had truly begun. 3 different environmental firms that had been considering him for senior positions withdrew their offer. His Harvard Business School alumni network, typically a source of lucrative opportunities, became a liability as classmates distanced themselves from the scandal. The financial implications were equally severe. Cascade Hospitality Group's withdrawal from the estate purchase eliminated the Blackwood family's primary source of liquidity for addressing their mounting debts. Without the resort sale, they faced immediate pressure from creditors, who had been patiently waiting for the promised windfall. Robert Chen had spent the day analyzing the family's financial exposure, and his preliminary assessment was catastrophic. They're leveraged the maximum on multiple properties, he explained during an evening phone call. The estate was essentially mortgaged to fund their lifestyle while they waited for the resort sale. Without that income, they're facing potential bankruptcy within months. The tax implications were even more serious. The IRS had responded to my documentation with unusual speed, announcing a formal investigation into potential fraud related to environmental tax credits and business expense deductions. The amounts involved were substantial enough to trigger criminal penalties if fraud was proven. Even more damaging was the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation's decision to suspend all certifications and credits associated with Ravenshollow Estate pending a complete review. This action had immediate financial consequences, triggering repayment clauses in several loan agreements that had been secured based on the property's environmental credentials. Thomas Richardson's law firm was facing its own crisis as details of their role in the systematic exploitation became public. The Vermont Bar Association had opened an ethics investigation based on evidence that the firm had knowingly facilitated intellectual property theft through fraudulent contract provision. Several clients had already terminated their relationships with the firm, citing concerns about ethical standards and professional conduct. As evening approached, the pressure on the Blackwood family became unbearable. Vincent finally emerged from the mansion to face the gathered media, but his attempted statement was a disaster that only deepened their problems. Clearly unprepared for hostile questioning and lacking his usual confidence, he stumbled through denials that contradicted documented evidence and made claims that were immediately challenged by reporters who had done their homework. "The allegations being made are completely false," he declared, his voice lacking conviction. "Our family has always operated with the highest ethical standards, and we've never engaged in any form of intellectual property theft." The response from reporters was immediate and devastating. They had copies of the internal documents I had provided, and they began reading specific passages that contradicted his denials. When confronted with his own company's psychological profiles of caretakers and detailed plans for intellectual property extraction, Vincent's composure collapsed completely. "I have no knowledge of those documents," he stammered, clearly lying. "If such materials exist, they were prepared without my authorization by subordinates who exceeded their authority." The attempt to blame Thomas Richardson and other subordinates was immediately recognized as desperation by everyone watching. The documents were clearly marked with Vincent's approval signatures and included detailed notes in his own handwriting. His willingness to throw longtime associates under the bus only reinforced perceptions of his moral bankruptcy. Catherine's subsequent appearance was equally damaging. Her attempt to portray the family as victims of a vindictive former employee was undermined by the overwhelming evidence of systematic exploitation spanning multiple properties and decades. Her claims that the caretaker's work had been preliminary research that required extensive development were contradicted by documentation showing exact implementation of their proposals. Harrison's brief statement was perhaps most revealing of the family's true character. His angry denunciation of the media coverage and his threats of legal action against disloyal employees and their conspirators demonstrated the same arrogance and sense of entitlement that had enabled their exploitative practices for so long. The family's unified response strategy was clearly failing. Their contradictory statements, obvious lies, and attempts to blame others only reinforced the credibility of the allegations against them. More damaging was their complete inability to express any remorse or acknowledgement of the harm they had caused to their victims. As the media circus continued into the evening, I received a call that surprised me. Marcus Webb, who had spent the day fielding questions from reporters while maintaining his commitment to factual accuracy, had been approached by representatives from 3 different conservation organizations about potential employment opportunities. "Seems like there's value in having integrity after all," he said with dry humor. "Amazing how quickly things change when the truth comes out." His experience reflected a broader shift in how the exploitation scandal was being perceived. Rather than being seen as a dispute between employers and disgruntled workers, it was increasingly understood as a systematic attack on the values that made Vermont's business community distinctive. The Blackwood family had violated the trust and reciprocity that underpinned relationships in the state's tight-knit professional networks. The response from Natalie Hayes's new colleagues in California was particularly gratifying. Her current employer at the Botanical Garden had issued a statement praising her innovative work and integrity, while simultaneously announcing increased support for her research projects. Several California wineries had reached out about consulting opportunities based on her documented expertise in organic viticulture. James Morrison was experiencing a similar renaissance. 3 renewable energy companies had contacted him about senior technical positions, specifically citing his innovative work on historic building integration that had been documented in the scandal coverage. His willingness to speak publicly about the exploitation he had suffered was being seen as evidence of professional courage rather than troublemaking. The broader implications of the scandal were becoming clear as the day progressed. This wasn't just about one family's unethical behavior. It was about systemic problems in how intellectual property was valued and protected in employment relationships. Legal experts appearing on news programs were discussing the need for stronger protections for employee innovations and clearer definitions of fraudulent inducement in employment contracts. Professional organizations were beginning to develop new ethical guidelines specifically addressing the issues raised by the Blackwood case. The Vermont Association of Landscape Architects announced plans for a comprehensive review of intellectual property protections for their members. Similar initiatives were being launched by engineering societies, environmental consultants, and property management organizations. The academic community was also taking note. Business schools were already incorporating the case into their ethics curricula, as an example of how systematic exploitation could masquerade as legitimate business practice. The psychological profiling that had been used to manipulate caretakers was being studied as an example of how personality assessment could be weaponized for exploitative purposes. As midnight approached, the estate had taken on an almost surreal quality. The media encampment outside the gates created pools of artificial light in the mountain darkness, while the mansion itself remained largely dark except for a few windows where the Blackwood family was presumably huddled with their lawyers and crisis management consultants. I spent the evening in my cottage, fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and potential employers while watching the coverage of a story I had set in motion. The satisfaction was profound, but it was tempered by recognition of the broader implications of what had been revealed. The systematic exploitation of talented professionals wasn't unique to the Blackwood family. Their methods were sophisticated and well documented, but the underlying dynamics existed throughout industries where creative expertise was undervalued and intellectual property protections were weak. The scandal had opened a window into practices that were probably more common than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The personal cost to the victims had been enormous, careers had been damaged, financial resources depleted, and professional confidence shaken by systematic psychological manipulation. The fact that justice was finally being served couldn't undo years of struggle and self-doubt that talented individuals had endured, but the response to the revelations was also encouraging. The business community's swift rejection of the Blackwood family's practices demonstrated that ethical standards still mattered in professional relationships. The media's thorough investigation showed that systematic exploitation couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. Most importantly, the support being offered to the victims proved that integrity and professional competence were ultimately more valuable than connections and inherited wealth. As I prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new developments in the rapidly evolving story, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I had been excited about an opportunity to care for one of Vermont's most beautiful properties. I had believed that hard work and professional excellence would be rewarded with respect and recognition. The reality had been far different, but the experience had taught me invaluable lessons about power, deception, and the importance of fighting back against systematic exploitation. The Blackwood family had chosen me as their victim because they believed my passion for meaningful work would make me easy to manipulate. They had been right about my passion, but catastrophically wrong about my willingness to accept injustice. Their own systematic approach had provided the tools for their destruction. Their detailed documentation of psychological manipulation, intellectual property theft, and financial fraud had created an overwhelming case against them. Their arrogance had prevented them from recognizing the threat until it was too late to contain. Most importantly, their crimes had been so systematic and well documented that exposing them had required not just courage, but careful planning and coalition building. The network of former victims, local allies, and professional contacts that had emerged during my investigation represented a powerful force for accountability and justice. The estate that had been intended as the scene of my professional humiliation had instead become the stage for the Blackwood family's downfall. The poetic justice was perfect, but the real victory was in the restoration of dignity and recognition to the talented individuals who had been systematically exploited for their expertise and dedication. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal and financial consequences of the scandal continued to unfold. But tonight, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully in my cottage, overlooking the gardens I had restored, knowing that truth and justice had finally prevailed over wealth and manipulation. The Blackwood family had spent years studying the psychology of their victims, never realizing that their own psychology was equally vulnerable to exposure and consequences. Their confidence in their immunity had made them careless with evidence of their crime. Their sense of entitlement had prevented them from recognizing legitimate resistance when it emerged. The game had changed completely, and the final score was clear. Justice had won decisively over exploitation, integrity had triumphed over manipulation, and the truth had proven more powerful than wealth and privilege combined. 6 months after the scandal broke, I stood in the same spot where Vincent Blackwood had first shown me the panoramic view of Ravenshollow Estate. The property looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed completely. The for sale sign at the entrance told only part of the story of the Blackwood family's spectacular fall from grace. The bankruptcy proceedings had been swift and thorough. Without the resort sale to provide liquidity, the family's heavily leveraged financial structure had collapsed within weeks. The IRS investigation had uncovered additional instances of tax fraud related to other properties, resulting in criminal charges and massive penalty assessments that made recovery impossible. Thomas Richardson's law firm had dissolved amid the ethics investigation, with several partners facing potential disbarment for their roles in facilitating systematic intellectual property theft. The psychological profiling that had seemed so sophisticated was revealed as evidence of premeditated fraud, strengthening both criminal and civil cases against the family. Most satisfying was the complete restoration of credit and recognition to the talented professionals who had been exploited. Natalie Hayes had received a prestigious fellowship to develop sustainable viticulture programs at universities across the country. Her work at Ravenshollow was now cited as a pioneering example of organic farming innovation, and she was in demand as a consultant for wineries throughout North America. James Morrison had been recruited by a leading renewable energy company to head their historic preservation division, developing sustainable power systems for heritage property. His Ravenshollow designs were being studied as models for integrating modern technology with traditional architecture, and he was speaking at conferences around the world about his innovative approaches. Sarah Chen had parlayed her recognition into a position with the National Park Service, where she was implementing wetland restoration projects based on the techniques she had pioneered at the estate. Her work was being featured in environmental journals and had attracted federal funding for expansion to other historic property. The ripple effects extended throughout Vermont's business community, where the scandal had prompted widespread examination of employment practices and intellectual property protection. New legislation was being developed to strengthen worker protections against systematic exploitation, and professional organizations had implemented enhanced ethical guidelines for member conduct. Diana Foster and I had indeed formed a partnership, creating a property management firm that specialized in ethical stewardship of historic estates. Our approach emphasized transparency, fair compensation, and collaborative relationships with all professionals involved in property improvement. The contrast with the Blackwood family's practices had attracted clients throughout New England who valued integrity over exploitation. The demand for our services reflected a broader shift in how property ownership and management were being conceived. The scandal had highlighted the importance of recognizing and valuing intellectual contributions from all team members, not just those with ownership stakes. Our firm's success demonstrated that ethical practices were not only morally superior but also more profitable in the long term. Robert Chen had expanded his financial consulting practice to include intellectual property valuation and protection services. The complex financial fraud uncovered at Ravenshollow had revealed gaps in how professional expertise was valued and documented in employment relationships. His new services helped both employers and employees establish clear frameworks for protecting and compensating intellectual contribution. Marcus Webb had been offered positions with several conservation organizations, but he chose to remain at Ravenshollow as the property's interim caretaker during the bankruptcy proceeding. His decades of knowledge about the land made him invaluable for maintaining the estate's condition while legal matters were resolved. More importantly, his testimony during the criminal trials had been crucial in demonstrating the systematic nature of the exploitation. The criminal cases against the Blackwood family had proceeded with unusual speed, thanks to the overwhelming documentary evidence and clear patterns of fraudulent behavior. Vincent received a 2-year federal prison sentence for tax fraud and conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft. Catherine was sentenced to 18 months for her role in the environmental certification fraud. Harrison received probation and community service, largely because his participation had been limited by his young age and recent entry into the family business. The civil lawsuits had been even more devastating financially. The former caretakers had banded together to file a class action suit that resulted in a multi-million-dollar judgment for damages, lost earnings, and punitive award. The judgment had been satisfied through the forced sale of the Blackwood family's various properties, leaving them with essentially nothing. Thomas Richardson faced separate criminal charges for his role in facilitating the fraud through deliberately deceptive contract language and coordination of the psychological manipulation campaign. His conviction and disbarment served as a warning to other legal professionals about the consequences of enabling systematic exploitation. The broader impact on Vermont's legal and business communities had been profound. The case had become a landmark example of how white-collar crime could be disguised as legitimate business practice, and it was being studied in law schools and business programs as an example of systematic corporate malfeasance. Professional licensing boards had implemented new continuing education requirements focused on ethical obligations in intellectual property relationships. The Vermont Bar Association had strengthened its ethical guidelines for employment contract drafting, specifically addressing the deceptive practices that had enabled the Blackwood family's crime. The media coverage had eventually expanded beyond regional outlets to national magazines and documentary producers interested in the broader implications of the case. The story resonated with audiences because it illustrated how systematic exploitation could affect anyone with specialized knowledge and professional dedication. Several books were being written about the case, including an academic analysis of how psychological profiling could be weaponized for exploitative purposes. The consulting firm that had prepared the personality assessments had faced its own investigation and eventual closure as clients discovered the unethical applications of their services. The estate itself had eventually been purchased by a conservation trust that was committed to maintaining its historic character while honoring the contributions of all the professionals who had enhanced its value. A plaque near the entrance now acknowledged Natalie Hayes's Vineyard Innovations, James Morrison's Sustainable Energy Systems, Sarah Chen's ecological restoration work, and the other caretakers whose expertise had transformed the property. The new ownership model emphasized collaborative stewardship, with advisory roles for the former caretakers and transparent decision-making processes that prevented any individual or family from monopolizing credit for improvement. It represented a complete rejection of the exploitative model that had caused so much harm. My own role at the estate had evolved into something I could never have imagined when I first accepted the caretaker position. As part of the Conservation Trust's management team, I was helping to develop educational programs that would teach sustainable land management, while highlighting the importance of recognizing and valuing intellectual contributions from all team members. The irony was not lost on me that the property where I had been systematically exploited had become a model for ethical stewardship and collaborative management. The The Blackwood family's crimes had ultimately created an opportunity to demonstrate better approaches to land conservation and professional relationships. The cottage where I had lived during my employment had been converted into a residence for visiting scholars and researchers who were studying the estate's history and ecological system. The library where I had discovered the evidence of systematic exploitation was now a research center focused on ethical business practices and intellectual property protection. The psychological profiles that had been used to manipulate caretakers were now part of a permanent exhibit about the dangers of weaponizing personality assessment for exploitative purposes. The documents served as a warning about how sophisticated psychological tools could be misused by unscrupulous employers to take advantage of dedicated professionals. The transformation was complete and deeply satisfying. A place that had been designed for systematic exploitation had become a center for ethical education and collaborative stewardship. The Blackwood family's carefully documented crimes had become teaching tools for preventing similar exploitation in the future. On this particular morning, as I walked through the gardens that multiple caretakers had restored and enhanced, I felt a profound sense of completion and justice. The talented professionals who had been victimized had received recognition, compensation, and restored career prospects. The systematic exploitation had been exposed and punished. Most importantly, lasting changes had been implemented to prevent similar crimes in the future. The view from the overlook remained as breathtaking as ever, but it now represented something entirely different. Instead of symbolizing the wealth and privilege that enabled exploitation, it showcased the beauty that could be created through collaborative effort and ethical stewardship. The land itself seemed to reflect the transformation from a site of systematic manipulation to a model of authentic partnership. Diana Foster joined me at the overlook, carrying coffee and the morning newspapers that still occasionally featured updates on the various legal proceedings stemming from the scandal. The business section included an article about new legislation being proposed to strengthen intellectual property protections for employees, directly inspired by the Ravenshollow case. "Hard to believe it's only been 6 months," she said, looking out over the estate that had become famous for all the wrong reasons before transforming into a symbol of justice and ethical business practice. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just accepted their severance offer and walked away," I replied, thinking about the courage it had taken to fight back against such powerful adversaries. "The same thing that happened to all the others," Diana answered firmly. "Your work would have been stolen, your career damaged, and they would have moved on to their next victim. The only difference is that dozens of other talented people would still be suffering in silence." Her words reminded me that my decision to fight back had consequences far beyond my own situation. The systematic nature of the Blackwood family's exploitation meant that exposing their crimes had prevented countless future victims from suffering similar treatment. The network of former caretakers had remained close, supporting each other through the legal proceedings and celebrating the career opportunities that had emerged from their restored reputation. We met regularly to share updates on our various projects and to ensure that the lessons learned from our experience continued to influence professional practices in our respective fields. Natalie Hayes had become particularly active in mentoring young professionals, teaching them to recognize and resist exploitative employment practices, while building careers based on integrity and authentic expertise. Her experience at Ravenshollow had given her unique insights into how talented individuals could be psychologically manipulated and professionally undermined. James Morrison was using his platform in the renewable energy industry to advocate for stronger protections for employee innovations, particularly in technical fields where individual expertise could be easily appropriated by employers. His advocacy had already influenced policy discussions at the federal level about intellectual property rights in employment relationships. The legal precedents established by the criminal and civil cases were being cited in courts throughout the country as other victims of similar exploitation sought justice. The comprehensive documentation of the Blackwood family's systematic practices had created a template for identifying and prosecuting intellectual property theft in employment contexts. As the morning progressed and Diana and I continued our walk through the estate, I reflected on the personal transformation that had accompanied the professional vindication. The experience of being systematically exploited and then fighting back successfully had fundamentally changed my understanding of power, justice, and professional relationships. The confidence that came from standing up to powerful adversaries and prevailing through careful preparation and strategic thinking had opened doors I never could have imagined. The property management firm Diana and I had created was thriving not just because of our technical expertise, but because of our commitment to ethical practices and transparent relationships. The recognition I had received for exposing the systematic exploitation had led to speaking opportunities at professional conferences and business schools, where I could share lessons about recognizing and resisting workplace manipulation. The psychological profiling that had been used against me had become a teaching tool for helping others understand how their own dedication and expertise could be weaponized against them. Most importantly, the experience had connected me with a community of professionals who shared similar values and commitment to ethical practice. The network that had emerged from the Ravenshollow scandal represented something far more valuable than any individual career opportunity, a group of people dedicated to ensuring that talent and integrity were properly valued and protected. As we completed our tour of the estate and prepared to return to our respective offices, I felt grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought me to this point. The position that had been intended to exploit and discard me had instead become the foundation for a career built on authentic expertise and ethical relationships. The Blackwood family's systematic approach to intellectual property theft had ultimately provided the tools for their own destruction. Their detailed documentation, psychological profiling, and methodical exploitation had created overwhelming evidence of criminal behavior that no amount of wealth or legal manipulation could overcome. The estate, that had been designed as a laboratory for perfecting exploitative practices, had become a model for collaborative stewardship and ethical business relationships. The property where I had discovered systematic manipulation had transformed into a center for education about preventing similar exploitation. The irony was perfect, the justice complete, and the transformation perfect. In attempting to destroy my career and steal my expertise, the Blackwood family had inadvertently created the opportunity for me to build something far more meaningful and sustainable. Their arrogance had blinded them to the possibility that their carefully chosen victim might possess the intelligence and determination to turn their own methods against them. The view from Ravenshollow's overlook would always remind me that true power came not from wealth or manipulation, but from integrity, collaboration, and the courage to fight for what was right. The estate had been transformed from a symbol of exploitation into a testament to the triumph of justice over privilege, truth over deception, and ethical practice over systematic manipulation. As I drove away from the estate that had changed my life so completely, I looked forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The foundation built through adversity and strengthened by victory would support whatever came next, and the lessons learned from confronting systematic exploitation would guide future decisions about professional relationships and ethical obligations. The Blackwood family had intended to write my story as another chapter in their chronicle of successful exploitation. Instead, their crimes had become the prologue to a completely different narrative about justice, integrity, and the power of fighting back against those who sought to profit from the dedication and expertise of others. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.